Well, hello there. This is the Picky Fingers Banjo Podcast. I am Keith Billick, and thanks for joining me. First of all, happy summer, everybody. It finally got here. And I guess I'm only saying happy summer to those of you who are citizens of the Northern Hemisphere. For those of you in the Southern Hemisphere, I don't know what to say. Too bad. I live in Michigan. We deserve some warm weather, too. But for anybody else who lives in Michigan or a similar state, you also know that the summertime is when all the construction crews come out. So I apologize if you're hearing any sounds of heavy machinery in the background. The crews are out working, digging gigantic pits all over my neighborhood. I think they're replacing some of the underground utility pipes and everything. So although I'm very happy that they're doing that, and that's important, for some reason, they didn't decide to work around my podcast recording schedule. So yeah, if you hear a little rumbling in the background, that's what that is, and I apologize if that's distracting. But anyway, here it is, episode 7. This is actually part 2 of a conversation with the one and only Alan Munde. So if any of you are listening to this but have not yet heard the first part of the Alan Munde conversation, you may want to go back and check out episode 6 first, to get caught up on the first part of that. But I have already heard from a lot of you that enjoyed that first half of the Alan Munde interview, and almost all of you say some version of, Alan is so cool, Alan's the best, and we loved hearing the stories that he was telling. And I totally agree, and there's going to be a lot more where that came from in this episode coming up. If you would like to leave me a comment about this or any other episode, or any other comments or questions or suggestions for episodes, you can do that at pickyfingersbanjopodcast@gmail.com, and I always enjoy hearing from any of you listeners. Another thing I want to mention, or rather remind you of, because I talked about it a little bit last time, is that I do have a Patreon page in which you can, for as little as $1, you can choose to donate money to support the podcast. That can be found at patreon.com/banjopodcast. The most recent supporter is a fella named Kevin Kerwin. I'm not sure where Kevin is from, but Kevin, wherever you are, thank you so much for your support, and I'm glad to hear that you're enjoying the podcast, and I hope you keep listening, so thanks again. But now we're going to get back to the conversation with Alan Munde. We're going to pick up right where we left off last time. Alan is just beginning to tell us how he got to become the banjo player in Jimmy Martin's band, and that was by knowing Doyle Lawson, who was also in Jimmy's band at that time. So here it is, the rest of the conversation with Alan Munde.
Doyle was in Jimmy's band, and if Jimmy didn't hire a banjo player, Doyle was going to play banjo, and he didn't want to do that. And he's a very good banjo player.
Yeah, I believe it.
And had actually played banjo with Jimmy some years before this. So he didn't want to do it, so he helped me. He talked to Jimmy and said, hire him, and I'll work with him. So Doyle and I got the job, lived with Doyle.
Did you have to actually audition, or did Doyle
No, I auditioned.
Just hook it up?
Oh, yeah, I definitely did. Just up at the Knoll Hotel. I played Cumberland Gap, maybe, I think. And Jimmy is real way into the music, and he immediately started coaching me on how to play it, and said, no, do this, don't do that, do this. At this point, do this, And so he had a really definite idea of what he wanted his banjo players to do. And some of those things were somewhat not what banjo players would want to do normally.
Yeah, like what?
Well, for instance, on Cumberland Gap, and I'm not warmed up, so I can't really play it. Well, it ends there. Well, he wanted it,
So he really dissects it down to every note.
Yeah. He said, no, end on that note because it's in with my guitar.
Okay.
And some other things he had, not at that moment, but just in the length of time I was with him. He had some notes were quick and some notes were lazy. And these right here, those are quick. But this, That's lazy. I'm not doing it well right now. You know, you made that last as long as you could.
Yeah.
So and you hear, and even to this day, you hear banjo players, and they just sort of flip it. You know, I can't even make myself do it, but it's just like, it's like it's a nothing. But in Jimmy's thing, it's really important. And a lot of his musical view, came from the fiddle, and especially Chubby Wise, because he really loved Chubby's playing. And it was sort of a bluesy kind of slide, and then just arrive at the note almost like at the last moment, and then
just in time. Yeah,
and so he liked that sort of thing. So he had sort of these quick things and lazy things. And then the other thing I remember is on a kickoff to a song, I would do this. And he'd go, no, the timing's not right. So I'd do it again. He goes, no, the timing's not right. And I would always look at my left hand, or my right hand, thinking, you know, it's the roll or the picking or something.
Yeah.
But, and I didn't discover this till after I left, it's, you know, when you play and you're playing all of these notes, the only thing you have to articulate them is your left hand, you know, because your right hand is just doing this steady stream of notes. So if I did this, that's just leaving my finger down. But if I do this, you know, when you make them short, you can make some of them short, some of them long, and the roll stays the same.
Yeah.
So instead of this, which is just all finger pressure the whole time, if you do this,
and that's what he was talking about,
I think ultimately,
the duration of notes.
Yes, yes. And there's a clip you see on YouTube somewhere where he's coaching a fiddle player to play Fire on the Mountain. And he's going, no, make that quick. You know, no, that's too long. And I think that's the kind of thing he's talking about, is just, you know, and even in Cripple Creek, you know, Earl Scruggs did this. You know, it's really long.
Yeah.
But if you listen to J.D. play, where Earl
took his time getting there.
Yeah. And so he was quick and long, you know, so he had a real sense of that particular aspect of it.
Were you ever able to predict, say, for a new song that you were rehearsing, which aspects of it he wanted quick and which he wanted long, or was that just a constant struggle?
It was a constant struggle then, because I really didn't pick up on what he was getting at, you know, and it was only after I left that I kind of went, oh, well, that's kind of what he's talking about, I think, you know, and it really does make a difference. And, you know, Bill Keith, who's taught at this Midwest Banjo Camp several times, he is the one that actually was the first one to write out all those Earl Scruggs solos that ultimately became the first edition of the Earl Scruggs book. And he had taken all that material and went to wherever Scruggs was playing and showed it to him. And, well, Earl didn't know what any of that was, so Bill would play it for him. And the one thing he mentioned, and there may have been others, but in Sally Goodin, right there, well, right here, that's the chord you're holding.
Yeah,
it's
basically an E minor.
Right. And banjo players kind of think of it as a triangle-shaped E minor.
Right.
Oh, well, Earl said, and as I'm looking at it, it's the E note on the third string is played here with the second finger. And Earl said, lift that finger up, because if you leave it down, it sounds like E minor. So he wanted...
Wow, yeah. And most of us would not even have heard or be aware of the difference.
Right. Here it is, all just leave your finger down. But he wanted... You know, and what it is, it's like an articulation. It's like your tongue cutting off a sound
Yep.
to make a sound short, or your lips or whatever you do to make a sound short. So it's that ability to make, within the context of this ongoing flow of rolls, to make some notes short and some notes long. And in fact, some notes, when they're shorter, sort of counterintuitive, is when they're shorter, they're more noticeable.
Right. Yeah, they draw attention to themselves if they don't just peter out.
Right. They sort of just pop up, you know. And so it's learning to control your fingers and have us, that goes in with this idea of playing the melody. If you articulate the notes of the melody that are fingered, that you have to fret, it helps the melody stand out a little bit more than if it were just sort of laying in the same level as all the other notes.
Mm-hmm. Now, from what I've heard of your playing with Jimmy, you didn't do much of the melodic style with him.
None.
Absolutely none.
None.
Okay.
He didn't particularly. He admired it as an accomplishment, but he didn't want it.
It wasn't his music to do that.
No.
Okay.
And because he would brag on, Bill Keith, how good a player he was, but he didn't want that in his music. And as a matter of fact, at one place I remember, he says, well, my banjo player can do it.
Okay. And talking about you?
Yeah.
Okay.
And said, play something. So I played a little bit of Sailor's Hornpipe, which is a Bill Keith presentation. And he says, now he can do it, but he doesn't want to. Well, what he meant was he didn't want me to do it. And
you don't want to if you want to keep your job.
Right. But he would he liked melodic things, and in a sense, but done differently, more like guitar. And, the famous bit on Hold What You Got.
Right. That was JD playing that, right?
Yes,
okay.
yeah. But it's all picked sort of guitarish.
Yeah.
Rather than...
more what we would call like a single string style these days.
That would be sort of a melodic version where all the notes are kind of ring out.
Yep.
Where he likes them, if you pick individual notes, he liked them to kind of stand out and be short.
More of a Reno-y kind of sound.
But really, really clean and clear with a really good tone and no fumble fingers,
Sure.
Nothing extraneous or out of the way as much as you could, because when we recorded, it was all live. Everything we did was live. And and I recorded, I think, maybe 12 or 13 titles with him, and every one of them was done live. I'd stand there, and the group would stand, not far from me, around one microphone if they were going to sing. And you just set up in somewhat of as natural a setting as you could to where you could hear each other. No headphones.
Yep.
No nothing, just okay.
Just go for it.
Yeah, go for it. And that's the way all that music was done, and you come up with a different sensibility than you do with, trying to, I got that, but I'd like to, punch, what we used to call punch in.
Sure.
Here, or could we export from another part,
mix and match to a click track. And
And
none of that.
None of that. Yeah. And that's, there's good things about it all.
Yeah.
And, but you come out with a different sensibility, and you watch those old country music shows that are all done live. And, I think they have this thing about, let's play as best we can, but we need to get through it. So if there's something in there that you having trouble doing, you need to
can't take too many
rethink
risks.
It. Yes.
That's not the time to go out on the limb.
Right. And I recorded one of my favorite recordings that I ever did is with Bobby Hicks. I did it's called Texas Crap Shooter. And they had told me what tunes he was going to record, and one of them is this Snowflake Reel or Snowflake Breakdown, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of a fiddle tune, and I worked it out in sort of a fiddle tune-ish way. And we got to the studio and to record it, and it was so fast.
A lot faster than you had
planned
anticipated.
Yeah. So I just could not get through it.
Oh, no.
His response was, we'll do it just plain vanilla. just play some chords and rolls and get through it. So I did that on a little bit of it, but then I got some other stuff in there. So as a result, it came out well, and it was successful, and we recorded all that stuff pretty much live. What I liked about it was his fiddle playing, certainly, but was the rhythm section was Roland White on guitar, Sam Bush on mandolin, and Junior Husky on bass, and it was just this powerhouse group.
Yeah, it's quite a section. Yeah.
Oh, man, it was, the cool thing about playing with really good players like that is that there's no place else to be but with them.
Right, yeah. It's amazing how effortless that can seem.
Yeah. And I always liken it to riding your bicycle with the wind.
Yes, exactly.
It's just, man, if bicycle riding were like this, you could ride up mountains and all the way across the country if you had the wind at your back.
With some groups, even from day to day, it seems like you can't play in time to save your life. And then other times with a strong section like that, almost anything you could do, you can't help but play in time.
Right.
When they're that strong.
I've had the occasion of setting in with other groups and it wound up being recorded and released. And one was the Kentucky Colonels with Roland and Clarence and their brother Eric on bass. And then another time was with, they were called Country Store at the time, but it was Jimmy Goodrow, Keith Whitley, and Bill Rawlings. And it was released. And in each case, they were so strong and so good that it was just, man, just jump in and don't let go, whatever you do.
What a difference.
Oh, yeah, it was really cool. Very fun. And, you get involved in jam sessions that feel real good, it's like that. And then others, it's just not right.
Just not happening for some reason.
Yeah. And Jimmy told me, he says, if you can play with me, you won't be able to play with anybody else.
Was he right about that?
He was, because once again, and I'm not saying he was ever out of time, but he had spaces in there that seemed like that took up a long time. And sometimes...
With his guitar rhythm or with his singing or what?
With all of it, with just his whole sensibility. For instance, just that much that he would do, it could be it seemed like really long. So that what you did, you would do, if we were start on a D chord, go to G, you would do that lick. Yeah. And it had to be just right or it wouldn't come out in time with his guitar thing.
Okay.
So I would go out to jam sessions and people would just, it was like they did that and were gone. And I'm still back here trying to
finish
my lick. And it did make it difficult, to go out and play with people because right away you see what they do a lot of is rush. They rush through the licks, rather than, if you play well and get it all going, everything is spaced out just right. It's already spaced out, and you don't need to rush anything to get it in, or slow down to get it in. Either way,
So was your feeling that Jimmy was doing it right and everybody else was rushing, or was it that Jimmy had it screwed up, but he knew how he wanted it?
I think it's a little of both. And, I mentioned that to Sonny Osborne one time, and he said, I always thought he dragged, and I think that's probably what he's talking about is when he would get to certain licks, more live than when we were recording, he was a little more attentive and a little more less in charge recording than he was live.
Okay.
Because he was he loved being in charge. And, he just liked, and he would do some things live that I think he did just to show us that he was in charge. Things would be going well, and then all of a sudden it was like the bottom would drop out. And it was because he thought it was going too fast, and it would just drag.
Yeah.
So a lot of it, just his sort of controlling nature.
Kind of a power
Yeah,
move.
Yeah. But when he was on and really, I believed him and wanted to be a good banjo player for him and did my best, as they all did. Everybody I ever knew that played with him
Definitely
tried to do it.
So going to your instrument here, you've long been associated with stelling banjos. At what point did you discover those or develop a relationship with stelling, and what do you like about those instruments?
Well, interestingly enough, back 1969 when I moved to Nashville, almost one of the first people I met was Jeff Stelling.
Okay.
And he was going to Vanderbilt. He was in the Navy, and they were sending him to school to be an engineer, I'll say. And I would hang out at his house, and he loved bluegrass, and he loved banjos, and played a little bit. And he would work on inexpensive Gretsch banjo, and he would work on it. And I think he built a banjo once, almost totally from the instructions in the Earl Scruggs book.
That had banjo building instructions. I forgot that.
Yeah, in the back of the book.
Okay.
And where on earth would you read about building a banjo at that time? So he got into it there, and then I left Nashville and went to L.A. and did the Country Gazette thing, and he, in the meantime, got stationed in San Diego. Mm-hmm. So I was up in L.A. in the early 70s playing with Country Gazette. He was in the Navy in San Diego and got out of the Navy with the idea of building banjos. He'd come up with this idea, and where he got it from, and it's the idea of how you set the tone ring on the rim.
Yeah.
And on the Gibsons, if you can see me out there, I'm holding my hand straight up.
Yeah.
So the sides of the rim are straight,
Right.
and it's flat on the top. And so their tone ring has to sit, if it's a good fit, it has to fit on 1, 2, 3 different surfaces. Actually, it's 3 different surfaces. And if any one of them are off a little bit, it's not a real good fit. Mm-hmm. So he came up with this idea of just fitting it on a beveled rim.
It's what he calls the wedge fit.
Wedge fit. Yeah. And where he got that idea is that's how propellers are mounted on shafts.
And that's something he had learned in the
Navy.
Military.
Yeah, because he had been a mechanic also.
Interesting.
And so on that, you just put it on. It's not like a cylinder and then the propeller fits onto that. It's beveled so that when you tighten it down, it pushes it down along this slope.
It has no choice but to be
fit.
A firm fit
Exactly.
everywhere. Yeah.
And so that's what his system is. So his tone ring and his rim go together.
Yeah.
And you can't change. They're not interchangeable with Gibsons.
Right.
So that was one of his innovations, and the design of it and the is all just the artistic part of it. But he called me and said he was making this banjo and be interested in me looking at it. So I did, and I liked it, and I played it. And for me, it was easier to hear. It was, and I'll use the term responsive. I never really owned, a for real Gibson banjo. It was everything I ever owned was a piece of this and a piece of that. And the one I had at the time, it was a good banjo, but this was, you didn't have to play it quite as hard, and it was a little clearer up the neck than the Gibson, and, just lots of things about it. I liked the neck he made at that time was a little wider and a little flatter, and it just seemed more playable to me at the time. And
so did you get one of his first ones that he made? Is that when or did he already have a business going by the time you
actually,
owned one?
He had made, if I said 5 or 6 by that point, and I maybe had 7, or I'd have to ask him.
Pretty early on.
Yeah,
though.
it was very early. And he was still working on the design and different things, but he had the instrument he had at that time he called the staghorn.
Yeah.
And that's what I began playing on, and it became sort of the flagship banjo of his catalog, and I still have one and play it. But I had an accident. Or I didn't have the accident. The airlines did, and broke off the headstock.
Oh, no.
I mean, that's a whole long story.
Yep.
But anyway, so I called him and asked him, I said, have you got just a production model that if it breaks, you can go over to the shelf and send me another one just like it? And he said, yeah, I'm doing this new thing called a Crusader, and it has a little different design on the headstock, and maybe the scale length is a little bit longer, and it's also mahogany, which many of his others, I think he said it's the first production model that's a mahogany banjo. Right. And so he sent me one, and I liked it, so it's what I play, and it's what I've recorded with the last, 15 years or so.
And you're still happy with the sound of those? You still hear the same type of responsiveness that attracted you to them in the
definitely. Yeah, I love it, and a lot of people think they're too bright, but then they'll always say, you're the only one. What do you do to your banjo? You're the only one that, makes the stelling sound, this certain way that they may like and not so bright. And, I say I hardly do anything to them. I'm really the minimal banjo setup guy. And I changed the strings before I came, and I really groused about it.
Even that much?
Just changing strings and my banjo's pretty filthy. Where people will take them apart and clean them up, and they'll try. I have friends that change strings 2 or 3 times a day, trying to decide. They'll have different sets, and they'll try them out.
Wow!
And I just
who's got time for that?
Well, they do, and I understand it. They're professional players, and they're interested in it and want to know things. So I don't, fault them for doing it at all. It's just not something I can do. I just get it to where I like it, and I try to play it as best I can.
Going back to your playing style, you mentioned that you had worked up arrangements of Bobby Hicks's version of the Snowflake reel and everything. That's something I noticed about your playing too, is how you come up with a lot of variations on those fiddle tunes. Did you have a specific approach to, say, sitting down with, you mentioned Sally Goodin,
right?
And you would play it 3 or 4 passes, and each time would be, you would extrapolate a little bit more melodically.
Yeah, because that's what the fiddle players do. And I'm from Oklahoma, as I said. So, and Oklahoma and Texas, it's sort of called Texas contest fiddling, but Oklahoma was very strong in that too. A lot of players came from Oklahoma. And that was sort of, it's a real vibrant, alive fiddle tradition that is very progressive. Mm-hmm. Not progressive in the sense of, contemporary music, but progressive within its boundaries.
Yeah.
They never give up on trying to come up with a little twist.
The next thing.
Yeah, because for them, the contest, and they'll go play against other fiddle players, and they have judges. And so there's a big one at Hallettsville. It's called the State Championship, and I go to it sometimes when I'm around. It happens in April, and I love it. It's just real cool. It's all these really, really, really great fiddle players get together and sort of knock their heads together. And they get down, it starts out with 50 in the open competition. There might be 50. They whittle it down to 15, down to 10, and then down to the top 3. And it gets down to the top 3, and one of them will get up there and play Dusty Miller. Well, the next guy will come up and play Dusty Miller because he thinks he's got a better one, and it's really cool.
Like a friendly, competitive kind of thing, or maybe not so friendly.
No, it's much more friendly today than it was with the, sort of the first generation of those players.
Yeah.
They were very, very competitive, and many of them were guarded of what they did. And the sort of the grandfathers of that style are Benny Thomason, and then there was a Major Franklin. And Major Franklin was a very, very crusty old guy, and as he was warming up, if anybody had a tape recorder, he would stop playing and tell them to turn it off.
Okay.
Where Benny was very, very giving and would show anybody anything. And as a result, there are all these tapes of Benny Thomason, and there's hardly anything of Major Franklin. So, he sort of lost out in the big picture.
Right.
But that was the way they were, and they were some of my favorite lines. There was a player from Oklahoma named Ace Sewell, and his dad was Gene Sewell, and he played in the old time. He was in his 70s or 80s, but Ace played at a little contest somewhere and won third. They had him up on stage, and they'd each come up and say a little thing, and Ace went up to the microphone, and he says, "You got a mighty fine little town here, but I ain't coming back."
Nice.
Yeah, and then Dick Barrett, who was another.
That's after he had won his third place.
Oh,
you wouldn't say that before.
Only third.
Okay.
Only third. And Dick Barrett's line, which I love, is, I asked Dick, "How'd you do in such and such a contest?" And he said, "Well, I won it, but they only gave me third."
Yeah.
So they were pretty, I think they admired each other, but there was always this edge to them. But nowadays it's much friendlier, and it's very, very nice. And there's a lot of younger people in it that don't know anything about, the crustiness of it or the prickliness of those early players, or they just hear rumors of it, but they're all very, very nice.
Yeah.
And incredibly talented and a marvel to see. And there's a lot of young women in it. There's a lady in Texas whose name escapes me right now, who has a school that teaches. I mean, she must have, I've heard she's had like 200 students.
Wow.
And they're all, not all, but many, many of them are young players who learn to play in schools, and now they want something to do additionally. And she's turned out just incredible Texas-style fiddle players.
Very good.
Really good, yeah. So it's a real, as I say, very vibrant, progressive, living tradition.
But that's where you got your ideas from, is hearing those people weave their variations on these fiddle tunes.
Oh, definitely. And the story on Sally Goodin with Eck Robertson, who was the first country artist to have a recording released. He and a friend, whose name escapes me, went to a Confederate Veterans Reunion in Richmond, Virginia, back in the 1920s, and read in a newspaper or got word somehow that they were recording, I'll call them folk artists in New York City. So they went up to New York City in their Confederate outfits.
Wow, okay.
And walked in.
Straight from there.
Yeah, and went up there and said, "Well, we're here, we want to record." So they recorded them. And among those recordings is Sally Goodin. Just Eck Robertson playing it all by himself. And it's a brilliant recording. And he would always tell the story that said, Sally Goodin had, I can't remember the number, 11, 13 boyfriends, and there's a variation for each one of them.
Oh,
and
wow.
He had played this and you can hear them all, and they're brilliant, and they're really cool. And that's sort of the genesis of that whole contest approach, is that recording of Sally Goodin.
Holy cow.
Yeah, it's 'cause,
interesting.
Yeah, and he's from Texas. He came back. He lived in Amarillo and would be at fiddle contests all through the 60s. And Benny Thomason picked up on all that. And, it was a friendly competition, rather than drinking and beating up on each other. They just try to out-fiddle each other. And they would, and I'd go to those contests, and sometimes there'd be a wad of fiddle players, and there'd only be one fiddle. Just the happenstance of the moment. And somebody would be playing something, and they were all itching to get their hands on the fiddle.
Trying to outdo each other. Yeah.
Well, and say, well, here's how I do it, was what is their thing. And the famous line of Eck Robertson was, he had listened to a fiddle player play something, and he'd go, "Now let me show you how that originally went."
Yeah.
So, you couldn't outdo them any way, shape, or form.
You weren't going to prove him wrong.
Right.
That's for sure.
So anyway, I picked up on that element of it and tried to come up with little different ways to do things on some of them, the ones that I cared to put my time into. And
did you have an approach for putting so much drive in your melodic playing? That's definitely something that sticks out to me as well.
It wasn't planned out. I just tried to play what I thought sounded good, but I always played it in the context of a band, I thought, and it sounded good. So I tried to, a lot of times on this melodic style, you don't have predetermined roles.
Right.
You just have to kind of go for where the notes are.
Go get them.
Yeah. And sometimes it falls out into a pattern that seems familiar and other times not so. So I would just try to watch for those, and so that it all came out to me sort of in bluegrassy patterns. Now, it's just a little bit of a forward roll and then a little bit of a backward and then a little alternating, all in one measure possibly. But I tried to have that sensibility about it and not approach it as a lot of individual notes. They were that, but within the context of what felt like a roll or some part of a roll to where it would hopefully survive.
A bit more recognizable.
Yeah.
Before we go, you've done a ton of teaching in your day. You ran that department at South Plains Community College. I've had a couple friends go down to you and learn some things.
Oh, good. Just to correct it, I didn't run it. I just taught there. There was my boss ran it, but I was important to the bluegrass element of the department.
Right. So if you had to distill down to maybe one or 2 points that tended to work for a lot of the bluegrass students, what are the things that you think are important for banjo players to work on?
Well, if you're going to play in this style, you have to listen to the players that really defined it a lot. And so I would always encourage students that I had made up at the time a cassette tape of 25, 30, it might have been 50 recordings that I thought were important to define the style.
Yeah.
And they were most of them were sort of medium to fast tempo. The slow stuff is another aspect, but mostly the roll, that involved the roll and getting melodies into rolls. That is, to me, as I hear players play, that is the kind of thing that I won't say is missing, but is not as prominent as I think it should be, which is being able to hear clearly the melody or an idea anyway of something rather than just the energy of the roll and then some notes. And so to really work on that and to understand how the rolls work and what rolls can do, and they can't do everything. So sometimes you have to abandon a roll and do something, another technique of some variety. But just understanding how the rolls work and being able to have them work in your favor, is really valuable. And so that, and then the other thing is just to take very small steps and be good at them, and then move on. Not that you have to completely master something before you move on, because playing is an accumulation. It's not, I've done A, now I'm going to move on to B.
Yes.
And then on to C. I've done B, I'm going to move on to C. It's sort of like I've got as much of A as I can right now, so I'm going to move on to B. And then I get as much of B as I can, and I move on to C. And then all of a sudden, well, look, A is coming along a lot better. So it sort of accumulates over time. But just to take small things and try to perfect them. And when I worked with Jimmy, that's one of the, what he wanted, his personal life and in part his career were not done right. It didn't match the rest of the world in a particularly good way. But when he talked about the music and how he wanted it, he wanted it to be done very professionally. And so that everything was really clean and clear, and you didn't have to listen hard to figure out what's going on. And he would say, if they can't hear what you played, you might as well have not played it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And so if you're going to do something just real simple, make it as good as you can. Just that little moment. Mm-hmm. And
make it easy for people to like what you're doing. Don't make it too challenging. Right.
And I always liken it back again to languages. If you speak real clearly, people understand what you're saying. But if you mumble, it's, what'd you say again? What was that? And
it doesn't matter if it's the most profound idea anybody's ever had if they didn't hear it.
Right. So, just those things. Understand the style as much as you can, and then try to perfect all the little details. That detail of just how long you put your finger down on a note, is a little detail that you should practice and listen to yourself do. And I encourage people to record themselves and listen back.
It's a whole new world.
Yeah. And I always liken it to looking in the mirror too closely. It's like, oh my God, is my nose really that big? Or
oh yeah, you see all the imperfections, but
but
if you don't see them, then they're still going to be there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think you're going to drive hordes of banjo players crazy now that we're all going to be paying attention to exactly how long we're holding our fingers down on that D string.
Once again, it's just you do it and then move on, but it comes back to, I should pay more attention to that. And after a while...
A little bit at a time.
If the other thing is that's real important is, I think, if you're going to play a song that has words, that you know the words. And you kind of sing along in your head so that the banjo is a representation, what your solo is, if you want it to be, is a representation not only of the melody, but actually of the syllables, to where if some syllables are short, you shorten them, and if they're long, you make them long. And also just to have syllabalized the lyrics to where, it comes out on your instrument that way. And then people won't say, I can't tell what you're playing. They go, that's, Bury Me Beneath the Willow or whatever.
And it all comes back to where we started by singing on the instrument, just like Pete Seeger would have
definitely
probably put in his book there.
Yeah, definitely. And that's what instruments are in a way, are just in some ways imitations of what people sing.
Right.
So there.
Well, hey, Alan, thank you so much for sharing all those stories with us.
Sure.
They were really interesting and fun to hear. And thanks for giving us your time, and hope you have a great weekend, okay?
I'll do it. I'll do it.
I'll see you around.
All right.
And that wraps it up for my conversation with Alan Munde. He's one of my true banjo heroes, one of my biggest influences. I highly recommend you seek out some of his recordings so you can hear what his playing is all about and put everything he said into that kind of context. You can also find him on the web. He has a website that is Al Munde's Banjo College. That's ALMUNDES banjocollege.com. You can email the show here at pickyfingersbanjopodcast@gmail.com, or to support the show, go to patreon.com/banjopodcast. So that's going to do it for this episode. I'm already hard at work on more episodes, so stay tuned. There's going to be plenty of good stuff in the future here. But until then, thank you so much for listening, and take care.